where I work, we attempted to give Agile a try. And in my experience, or in our team's experience, it was a small team, 3 people, and it was the testing aspect, the automated testing that really, I think, broke us. And I'm just wondering if you have any tips to how to get that automated testing up and going.
I've gone through it a few times, and it depends really on what you're trying to build. To be honest, if you're building user interfaces that have, your bugs end up being things like, well, when I move the cursor, I want the focus to change, or when I move the cursor, I want a hover hint. I don't know how to test those automatically. I use people for that.
Right.
So for the UI stuff, I use people. People are expensive, both in terms of how much you have to pay them and in terms of how inaccurate people tend to be compared to if you can automate it totally. But knowing that, what we try to do when we build our software, and it goes back to last night's panel when Steve and Tom talked so much about APIs and trying to isolate everything you can in lower layers and data layers. If you have your UI basically just a skin on top of your PL/SQL modules and deeper data layers, you can test the modules for what data is being presented up to the top layer. So it basically causes the UI layer to be as thin as possible, and therefore the number of tests that a human has to run is as small a set of tasks as possible. Now, from there down, it really depends on what kind of processing is taking place. If it's for example, a lot of what we do is text file processing. So we'll take a 2 megabyte file in, we'll transform it, and a 50 kilobyte file comes out. Well, that's fairly easy to test by using just the Unix diff code. So we basically, we say that for this input, we expect the output to be exactly like this, or maybe with a -b flag, we can say, I don't care about the blank spaces so much, but it has to pretty much like this. Some problems with the diff include things like if your output is expected to contain the current date, well, the current date's never going to be the same as what you, quote, expected. So sometimes you have to write your own tool suite to do the diff to say, yeah, as long as it's in the date format, it passes the test. But it doesn't necessarily have to say the same date as my expected date. Or you can use template variables and things. I haven't investigated, but I would imagine that there probably are open source ways of using software that other people have created to do that kind of stuff. If you move kind of down into the more functional, detailed realm, we write a lot of our stuff in Perl as well as PL/SQL. And I mentioned in the talk this test anything protocol, TAP. Every language I know of has some kind of a TAP protocol interface: C, Perl, C#, Visual Basic, PHP, Python, everything. So basically that gives you a set of functions that you can use to test your functions. So if you've got a little function that creates a date from an Oracle TIM value, for example, well, I can throw 600 little test inputs in there and say, for this input, this function has to return that output. And then when I run the test, the TAP protocol basically gives me an interface that I'll have a function called is. And the first argument, I believe, let me get this wrong. The first argument is a function call and its arguments, and the last argument is what I expect to get out. So is just runs this on these arguments, and if that doesn't come out, it prints an error message. And if it does come out, then it says everything. So we actually have those 3 levels of tests in our company. We have functional unit testing, which we have tons of them. They run really quickly. And then we have the sort of the big, this input has to create that output at the program execution level. And then at the top we have, in as thin a layer as possible, the UI testing, which we do a lot more.
Nice. Before Kscope kicked off, Mike Riley asked for some input from you as to why you think Kscope is good for the people who are too lazy to read. Could you share a little bit with us?
I hope it's not too hard to read if you go to my blog. It's carymillsap.blogspot.com.
Remember that.
carymillsap.blogspot.com. And I don't know, I guess this was about a month and a half ago. The reason I like it here is because I'm a performance person. I've been a developer focused on performance since the very beginning of my career back in about 1985. When I came to Oracle, it was sort of odd that developers weren't the people who were, quote, supposed to focus on performance. That seemed to be something the DBAs did. And just if you register for a conference, you can see that bias, because in the registration where you click through the, what am I, what track do I want to be in, there's usually no performance track in the development track, or no performance topic in the development track. The performance topic is always in the DBA track. And in the blog post, I explain why I think that's true. And it goes back to in the early days when these conferences were born, I think that the database administrators were typically the only technical people on these projects. And a lot of projects that I visited, for example, were stock products shipped by Oracle or by some other big vendor. So somebody just basically gets in the mail, a 40,000 table schema with 200,000 SQL statements, and nobody on site developed any of that. They purchased all that. It came on a tape. But now they've got this DBA who sometimes has to define indexes that weren't shipped and has to figure out why is this report running slowly. And there were no developers on site because why would I have developers? I bought a product. So I think that's most of the reason why DBAs ended up feeling like they had to own the performance space. But in fact, probably 90%, if not 99% of the leverage about performance is in the hands of the developer. So I think I can see kind of the tide starting to swing a little bit, and definitely at this conference, at the ODTUG Kscope conference, we've got people who they're all developers, and I've seen significant interest in how do I make my code perform better, because nobody really wants to be the person that laid the egg, in the production environment. Like, yeah, I wrote that horrible thing. So
it's mine.
Right. So people want to do a good job, and I think that the performance domain is one of my goals is to try to push more attention to it into the developer space, and I think it's being received fairly well.
Well, that's great. Thanks for being here, and
my pleasure.
Have a great time at Kscope.
Thanks very much.